worker. I was involved in the relocation of families from the Brittingham and Triangle redevelopment projects.
This is on January 9th, is it today?
January 7th.
January 7th, 1984. This is an interview being recorded for the Historic Madison Oral History Project. First of all, Mrs. Zmudzinski, could you tell us how you happened to get into the position of being the relocation officer? What was the project involved?
I happen to be the wife of the director of Madison Neighborhood Centers located in the Triangle, and the organization Neighborhood House had a local citizen neighborhood board of directors that was very interested in what may influence or change their neighborhoods, was involved in doing this, and I knew that some changes, urban renewal possibilities were in the wind, and I volunteered to do this at one point, but was hired when the time came for needing to relocate families by the City Planning Department at that time.
And by relocate families, what did you mean? You had to find
families, that meant finding safe, decent, and sanitary housing at a price that each individual or family could afford upon displacement from the areas to be redeveloped.
And did you, in the course of this, you were given the power to rent, were you? Did you actually help people make decisions about where to go? And
my responsibility was to uncover, find housing based upon the information I received from each family as to their income, their size of family, their desires and wishes in terms of where they wanted to relocate, find it. But I looked in newspapers. I had a small staff of two. We were a staff of 2 people with a secretary and some social work student help. The way we looked for housing was to ask friends, advertise in the newspaper, peruse all of the ads in the paper, contact real estate firms, talk to existing public housing units which existed out at Truax, any resources we could locate in the city that would
how many
assist.
Families were involved in the relocation project, and how long did it take for the relocation?
There were 1,133 individuals, the population of the Triangle, when we started in October of 1961. We relocated. It took us from October of 61 until January of 1965 to complete the relocation of individuals, families, and businesses.
So it took 4 years, which was a long, and I gather because of the shortage of experience in this whole field that there were many, many problems connected with relocating that what seems to be a rather large number of people.
It was difficult from the point of view that although there was general neighborhood agreement that something needed to be done with this area, and there was tacit agreement to some redevelopment, I think the actual act of relocating families, many of whom had spent many years or most of their lives in the area, of relocating aged people, of relocating poor, low-income families, of which there were a large number of all of these, and of relocating minority families, primarily black at that time, and students in the area. I think these all presented special problems in relocating.
It was a unique kind of neighborhood, wasn't it? With the neighborhood house, St. Joseph's Church, that little conservative Jewish temple, and the Italian Methodist Church, which were great magnets for, each one of them had a very strong constituency, didn't it?
They did. It was primarily, initially, a largely Italian, Sicilian, Albanian ethnic community, but a large number of Jewish families that moved in there to be close to their church, to their synagogue, and there were as some families had already begun to move, there was a large influx of low-income families because units were renting cheaper in that area than other places, and students could find low-income housing. So these were all special kinds of people that had to be relocated.
Now, the reason that this is an important subject in connection with open housing was that, or the open housing ordinance was, as I understand it, that the whole problem became focused in the public eye at the time of urban renewal in the Triangle, Brittingham area. Suddenly people realized what the problem of minority housing in Madison was when they tried in a sort of a concerted way to move these people out. So that you probably were the forerunner of the drive to bring to pass an open housing ordinance in the city of Madison.
We found that it was most difficult to relocate minority families. Of the 1,130 some, there were 647 white and 343 Negro people when first neighborhood house survey was made in October of 1960. And although predominantly white, none of the blocks were unmixed in the Triangle. And of the 236 families, 160 were white and 76 were non-white, and there were other additional individuals that were non-white. Now, they were predominantly of low income, primarily renters, although there were some owners among the minority families. And just finding a place for a minority family to be permitted to inspect the unit, to look at it as a possible rental or a possible purchase of home situation was very discouraging. We often, when I took a family to a home, the door would be slammed in our face, or when we called and asked to show to a family, if it were indicated that the family was non-white, we were very often told that was not available to non-whites. If they showed the unit to a black family, there was very often a proviso that said, but other people have looked at it and they have come before you, and there was no way of being sure that that was the situation. Therefore, we urged the consideration of an Equal Opportunities Commission to be created, along with certainly building of public housing to meet the needs of low-income.
And was there a public housing bill?
The only public housing at the time was at Truax, and there were, I forget the number of units that were built during the war, primarily for Air Force people, and additional units that were temporary and substandard that could be used, except that we did not relocate anybody into substandard housing. It was against the regulation and the law to do so. The survey had indicated that in order to relocate numbers of low-income families, we needed at least a certain number of units for the elderly, which we thought should be built right on the Triangle site. We did not want to see public housing built in one spot and be high-rise, which was not what Madison was like at all. We wanted the sites to be scattered. We wanted some wherever we could find property. And actually the sites were found, and public housing was passed. The idea of public housing was approved, and it was built on 3 different sites at Webb Avenue in South Madison, and on the Triangle, with additional units being built at Truax.
This is the Braxton Apartments?
Braxton Apartments are the ones that were built for elderly people. Mm-hmm. Elderly and disabled were the only ones that were
I gather that's been quite a successful.
That was 40 units, and it was just, or was it 60 units? Anyway, it was a very successful. Many people who were displaced were able to rent units practically on the very same site where their old units had stood before they were demolished, and so they stayed in the same area.
What about Bayview? Of course, that was...
Bayview came along later, and there was a lot of interest in creating something that would revert to the city, but at this point would be made available for low-income and needy families. And a group of people got together and worked with the federal government in order to make that a possibility. Now, I understand that reverts to the city in about 40 years.
40 years.
40 years from the time
Well, it's getting on there.
it's getting on there.
Well, the project on which you were working, I gather, was one established in accordance with federal regulations, that if federal money was going to be used to redevelop, places had to be found for the dislocated people.
That's right.
Were you paid by the federal government?
I was paid by the Redevelopment Authority, and I presume, yes, the salary, of course, was federal, with some participation, I'm sure, by the local government.
And, but you had the cooperation, I assume, of the Plan Commission and the other.
Well, they were the people responsible for carrying out. First of all, the Plan Department was responsible for the urban renewal project on Brittingham, and I think it started that way with the triangle. However, as time went on, the Redevelopment Authority was created, and that was primarily, I believe, and I'm not too sure of my facts here, to permit the authority was granted by the state legislature eminent domain in order to purchase property, and it had to be done in a certain
fairly priced and the decision of the court.
Yes.
Out of your effort, of course, the community became aware that open housing was a real problem in Madison. And we've been made re-aware, I think in the last few months, with the school problem, that it's still, open housing is not a fact in the city of Madison as we assumed it was. We also have always assumed that Madison had no problems with anything like this, that it was an open city and everybody loved living here and side by side with each other. But as I said before, you were the one that started and brought to the community's attention the difficulties involved in trying to open up the housing in the city. Can you describe some of that with us, to me, about how that was accomplished, what sorts of things you ran into?
As you know, there had been an attempt to create public housing some years before, in the 50s. I think it was 1950, and I think the question as put to a vote, if you were for public housing, you had to vote no.
One of those tricky ones.
It was one of those tricky ones. And of course, public housing did not pass at that point. At this point, we realized with minority families, with low-income families, we needed to have public housing. The Madison, what we found that the relocation plan was completely unrealistic in terms of existing housing resources. Certainly was over-optimistic about the prospects of developing new housing resources. It certainly didn't know anything regarding the needs of the people to be displaced. They seemed to be the last to be considered. The relocation plan was misleading in terms of regard to the availability of financing on liberal terms for people who wanted to buy. And it was uninformed as to the problems of black families to be displaced, and misinformed as to the availability of housing at reduced rates for low-income families. And actually, the relocation staff was trying to operate in a community which was unprepared and often hostile to the requirements of the program and to the people being displaced. The relocation program attempted to carry out its responsibilities within a framework which places emphasis on the physical aspects of acquisition and demolition without effectively coordinating the human aspects of the program. And we were attempting to carry out a program which often required technical services of specialists in building inspection, legal advice, real estate, without the benefit of such necessary specialists. Often, desirable units were rented before we could have them inspected and referred. real estate agencies, property management organizations, builders, utility companies, churches, welfare agencies, civic neighborhood groups, local newspaper staffs, local offices of FHA, and private individuals were solicited. With very few exceptions, rentals managed by real estate companies and property management organizations were unavailable to the Madison Redevelopment Authority on any priority basis. They preferred to advertise in the newspaper, which we can't blame them for. Some real estate men frankly advised they didn't want us to list their units or to refer displaced families to them. The NAACP, the Coordinating Committee on Social Concerns, the local FHA office, and private individuals were very helpful, but the number of referrals were limited.
Does this account for the fact that it took you 4 years to...
I think that's part of it, but I don't think that you can move large numbers of families without allowing a lot of the impact of the need to move to sink in. And there was no wish on the part of the relocation staff to rush people out, to make them move and make decisions hastily. But yes, the fact that we did not have an Equal Opportunities Commission, which we had to promote actively, the fact that we did not have housing, public housing, low-income housing for families that had low incomes, certainly held up the whole procedure to a large degree.
To what extent are you aware of what was going on in other cities at the same time? Were there other projects similar to this in progress?
We were quite aware that, and we perused all the information we could get our hands on of what was happening in other cities where redevelopment, urban renewal, certainly total clearance kinds of projects were going on. I think, if anything, I must say Madison was probably easier to accomplish a relocation than, let's say, Chicago or New York or Cleveland or Detroit. I think I'm aware that to the present day there are vacant lots in major cities where people were displaced, houses were demolished, and hasn't been replaced.
In Milwaukee, a huge empty space that was...
Yes. And of course here, it seemed to us a very long time before public housing was built, before the units that, the businesses that, and the medical facilities that now stand on the site were developed. It did take a number of years.
When the preparation began for the open housing ordinance that was finally adopted in 1963, I assume that you were one of the prime movers in bringing to the attention of the various constituencies in town, the churches and all the other organizations that eventually helped out in passing the ordinance.
Well, we tried to be in contact with all of those organizations that were concerned and interested, and I think it was a concerted effort to get an Equal Opportunities Commission going and open housing accepted in the city. And I remember that many people testified our documentation of our experience from day to day with trying to relocate minority families, black families, low-income families in the city were used to present to the city council the kind of need.
The only hard evidence that was available.
Right.
And you had spent some time collecting it.
Right. And I think it did make a difference. I think that, as I recall, the council was split on the whole idea of should we have this or not, both housing and equal opportunities. And I believe the mayor broke the tie.
Yes, it was a very dramatic moment when it finally all came about. And I think the people look at it now wonder why it was so tense at the time, but 20 years ago, the world was different than it is.
Well, I think we've progressed, but I think we see it today, even with all the new laws and legislation and equal opportunity, that there can be discrimination. People may theoretically or agree that there should be public housing, that there should be equality, but somehow when it strikes next door to one or in the neighborhood, there is still reticence to accept.
That's true. What about this neighborhood that we're sitting in right now? Are there minority families?
There are, to my knowledge, very few, 3 or 4 within, a few blocks of my home.
Of course, the minority population in Madison is still relatively small.
Relatively small. It was smaller, of course, at the time when we worked with the relocation. I believe it was under 5%.
Were the black
minority.
families the hardest to relocate? Although I imagine students were difficult, and
There were very few others. At that point, we didn't have the number of Asian families. If we did, they were those that were students and generally pursuing advanced degrees at the university. Somehow, if you could say this family was a student family from Nigeria or someplace in Africa, and they were a student family, they were more easily relocated than the black families that were native to Madison. For some reason, whether it was the educational level or I can't say, but sometimes you would find the temporariness may have had something to do with it.
There, I gather at Bayview there are a very large large percentage of those occupants are Asian.
At this point, I'm not, I'm not that familiar with what's there now, but initially they were a mix of students of all kinds of families, predominantly low-income and needy families. The other thing is we had to build, units that would house 10-member families as well as single elderly.
Now, how did that happen?
Well, the elderly certainly, we took account and we knew how many families we had that had, that were 10-member families. And of course that would take a 4-bedroom unit, at least 4 and 5-bedroom units. So we did scatter those in South Madison and out at on the east side in the Worthington-Breske Avenue area where new public housing units were built. With the elderly, it was simply 1 or 2 bedroom because generally it was a single person or a couple or a family that might still have a son that might be disabled or in some way a 3-member family, but those were small. The major problem was to find housing large enough and standard for the large families. Right.
And you were able to do that?
We did. Well, we did not relocate any families into substandard units. If they moved into substandard units on their own and against our advice, we continued to work with them until we found other units and referred them to them. Many families moved away, as you know, moved into units and then were moved into the public housing units back again. So they made more than one move when those units became available. You see, they weren't available perhaps when the house was first acquired and they moved. And some of them moved into substandard housing. Those primarily black servicemen who were stationed at Truax were able to obtain units after some time when those were built in Sun Prairie for Air Force personnel, and they were given priority in those units. Of course, many of them were transferred elsewhere, overseas, so we can't count them as relocations exactly, although we did pay for all movement of goods and family equipment and furniture and all of those
Does this coincide in any way with the development of some trader courts around?
We did not, I personally did not consider them standard housing at that time, and I'm not sure that it promoted the development of those at that time.
The people were treated as permanent residents, and housing was sought on that basis then.
Right.
Not just,
Right.
but of course, the timing there coincides with this enormous burst in the moving around of families from place to place
It did.
and flight to the suburbs and so on.
Well, there was not that much flight to suburbs. I think people wanted primarily to stay close to the triangle. There were a few families that moved out into more residential areas west and east of the city. But most families wanted to stay very close. Primarily the Italian ethnic people wanted to stay close to church, which now would be St. James, the other side of, just a stone's throw away from where St. Joseph's used to be. So many families moved, as I say, right across Park Street into that area, the Longfellow, at that time, school area around Madison General Hospital, not too far away. Other groups of people, when the housing was built on Burr Oaks, which was developed, many Italian families moved there also, bought new housing there surrounding the Lincoln School.
And the Italian Methodist Church is close by there, isn't it? The new church is close to the...
I don't know
South
where the
Line.
Italian Methodist Church is. St. Joseph's moved out on the Beltline, close to the area at Burr Oaks, yes, the other side of the Beltline.